Internationally, it's clear that the Americans are looking around after years, as Trump does correctly put it, kind of being asleep at the wheel and seeing a world that's very different. And that sense of insecurity, the vulnerability, the vulnerable superpower is also what's driving a lot of this geopolitical instability.
The political class in general, but this Labour Party in particular, their deference to international law is a way of avoiding trying to even think about broader geostrategic questions and interests.
Yeah.
You just defer to the ruling of the international court, and therefore no more needs to be said about it.
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers. In the studio, as ever, with me is Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And joining us down the line, live from Brussels, is Jacob Reynolds from MCC Brussels. Welcome, Jacob.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up on the show today, we will be discussing Trump's designs on Greenland, the surrender of the Chagos Islands, and the folly of the Chinese embassy in London. But before we get into all that, Tom, you've got a very exciting offer to tell the viewers and listeners about.
I do. It's January sale time, still on Spike. So if you're not already a Spike supporter, now is 100% the time to sign up. For the course of this month, you can become a Spike supporter for just £1 a month for 3 months. That will give you unlimited access to the website. You can listen to the bonus podcast that we do every single week of the Spike podcast. We've also got all kinds of exciting events coming up, which you can get priority, discounted, even free tickets to. So if you want to avail yourself of that offer, go to spiked-online.com/support. The other very exciting announcement that I have to make, as we did on the podcast last week, is that our friends over at the Free Speech Union are having a fascinating discussion on Thursday next week. It's in defence of jury trials, with David Lammy trying to scrap them. It should be a fascinating evening. It's taking place on Thursday, the 29th of January. And if you want to get your tickets to that London event, you can get a discount if you're a Spike supporter or if you're a Free Speech Union member. So if you're Spike supporter, you should already have had an email about it, but if not, you can go over to the FSU website and get your tickets there. So yes, sign up to become a Spike supporter. If you are not one already, it's a completely bargain basement price right now, and also get your tickets to the FSU event. We hope to see you there.
Yeah. Find your ticket in the show notes. If you're a Spike supporter and for whatever reason you haven't received your ticket, then just drop us an email at supporters@spiked-online.com and we'll be able to help you out. So, past week, Trump has been ratcheting up and then ratcheting down his threats over Greenland. He threatened to impose quite significant economic sanctions, major tariffs against his NATO allies, those who stood up to his kind of threat to acquire the entire territory of Greenland. He says that there's now the future shape of a deal coming into place. We don't really know the details about that yet. Suggests that someone on one side has folded in some way. But Tom, what have you made of the past week or so of theatrics? I mean, it has been quite extraordinary to see, the leader of the free world essentially beating up on his supposed allies.
Oh, definitely. At the same time, I think this has ended for now, at least where many people thought it would, which is that you had Donald Trump coming with very bellicose rhetoric, even talking about potential military action, or certainly hinting at it, only to climb down. Originally in his address to the WEF, where he, in slightly cryptic terms, suggested that it wouldn't come to kind of all-out conflict, and then in this fudge of an unknown arrangement between himself and Mark Rutte, head of NATO, being thrashed out. I think it was clear that there was potentially always fudge in the offing because of the fact that America already have a base on Greenland. There's already scope under existing arrangements for them to have a further military presence there, which, if the primary concern is building this kind of US air defense as well as keeping China and Russia out of that part of the Arctic, that's where you would assume these things would have quietly started. But it's the way in which it's raised all these kinds of questions at the WEF, but in kind of foreign policy circles more broadly, about the state of the supposedly rules-based international order. Is it dead? And also what might replace it? The way in which that's been generated both at the Davos conference and broadly has been particularly interesting, even as we wait to hear what the details of this particular deal, or shape of a deal, as we've been told, or framework of a shape of a deal maybe, that we've been flaunted so far. Yeah,
definitely. And Jacob, one thing it seems to have highlighted once again, in a similar way that the Ukraine conflict and Trump's dealing with that has highlighted, is the weakness of Europe, in a sense. Europe feels like a second-tier power in relation to the United States. There is a worry that, what Trump gets, or what Trump wants, he might be able to get simply because of the relative mightiness of the US compared to us.
Yeah, well, that weakness, I think, and exists on both sides, actually, helps explain a lot of what is otherwise a completely incomprehensible series of events, especially resulting in the fact that there's now a deal, whereas previously Trump had said it's essential for world peace and the future of America, and that there's not a deal, but that America fully controls Greenland. And so to climb down from that to anything is kind of incomprehensible given the stakes that were raised. And it is a tale of two weaknesses. It's the weakness of the European powers who have been on their, as we put it in Spiked a few times, on their holiday from history, where they haven't had to think about things like national sovereignty, defense, geopolitical competition. They've been completely had open borders and empty heads when it comes to dealing with the world order. And so they're obviously in a very weak position, and Trump is to some degree taking advantage of that. Although there are some people in the American administration who say that it's actually about reminding Europe about how weak they are, not to punish them, but to kind of spur them to action. And that's probably at play here too. But you shouldn't, I think, underestimate the degree of weakness that's kind of on display on the American side as well. I mean, firstly, at home in America, you've got this incredible situation of almost open revolt against the deportation, ICE raids policy that the Trump administration was elected to do. And you've got this state of kind of semi-civil war in places in America. But then internationally, it's clear that the Americans are looking around after years, as Trump does correctly put it, kind of being asleep at the wheel and seeing a world that's very different. They're now very concerned about the threat posed by China, the continued threat posed by Russia, et cetera, et cetera. And that sense of insecurity, the vulnerability, the vulnerable superpower is also what's driving a lot of this geopolitical instability.
Yeah, that sort of the Don Roe doctrine, the focus on the Western Hemisphere, that resulted in the extraordinary actions in Venezuela that we were talking about the other week. That does sort of stem from a sense that maybe in this world where there is competition with China, where there is competition with other powers, a more multilateral world, America can't extend itself in the way that it used to be able to in the immediate sort of post-Cold War years.
Mm-hmm. And speaking to Jacob's point, Phil Mullen, also a Spike contributor, has termed it as the kind of precarious strength of America under Trump, which is to say there is this desire to reassert its might and to throw its weight around, but also that's coming from a position of relative weakness in terms of America's might historically. So you see, as we've discussed in the podcast in recent weeks, the reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine, particularly in relation to the Americas, but not obviously the Venezuela raid topping people's minds there. But that's also in a context in which China, Russia, Iran have already made significant inroads, not just into Venezuela, but into Latin America more broadly. And therefore, the extent to which this becomes almost slightly performative, it's about kind of a demonstration of intent or potential intent, which has become so significant there. And then on the point of the European weakness, I think it was so perfectly summed up by that very cursory sort of military deployment, which was made to Greenland in light of Trump's tariff threats at the end of last week, something which was seemingly willfully misinterpreted as an act of aggression towards the US by some people around Trump. He since suggested that maybe he was misinformed, and this was about showing that Europe can defend Greenland and that part of the Arctic themselves. They don't need to. It doesn't need to be under American control in order for that to take place. The fact that we sent one officer, I mean, it was more of a kind of away day than it was a serious kind of. I don't think
there's any more than
maneuver.
20 in total from the NATO countries.
Underscores the total weakness, which say what you will about Donald Trump, his sort of points in relation to NATO and the freeloading, particularly of Western Europe, in relation to that over many years is very well made. This holiday history has been going on for far too long. One thing that I think has been really interesting about the WEF and the Davos conference this year is the fact that where in the first Trump term, Davos was very much a kind of site of pearl-clutching revolt against Trump and everything that he represented. This time around, there's a sense of begrudging acquiescence to what he represented. The sense that, first of all, that America is not willing to play the role that it was previously perceived to play during the years of the rules-based international order and unchallenged American hegemony, but also that the challenge that he was pushing on Europe is now being responded to, or the challenge that he's pushing on the rest of the Western world and the middle powers. So you had the Mark Carney speech, the Prime Minister of Canada, speaking kind of more in sadness than in anger about the decline of what he called the fiction of the international rules-based order, which no longer holds up in the absence of America willing to play its role, talking about the extent to which it's essentially weakened middle powers because they've become too intertwined with much larger powers who economically or otherwise can exert control over them, and the need to take the world as it really is rather than the world as we would like it to be. I think it's probably been a bit too much praise lavished on Carney. The substance of what he's talking about is not entirely clear, and he's still sort of doubling down on the other kind of globalist institutions, which he seems as maybe kind of riding to the rescue in an era in which you have America not playing ball in the way that it would previously. But I think that has really been fascinating. People have been forced to recognise, in light of the return of Trump and of course his insane bellicosity in recent days, that that holiday from history, as we were talking about, has come to an abrupt end, and that they need to adapt. It's not obvious that they are willing to do the things that are necessary to do that, or if they're even capable of doing so. But the mood is so different than it was even a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, just simply the lack of discussions on the climate and on gender, on DEI and stuff like that was also a reflection of that at Davos. Jacob, I don't know, before we move on, if there's anything you wanted to say about this particular World Economic Forum, because, certainly feels like the most significant one that we've seen in any of our lifetimes. Usually it's a bit of the butt of a joke. Davos man is a bit of a bit of a caricature of the sort of globalist type who we like to, rain down on occasionally. But this year was so different.
Yeah, well, at one level, it's almost interesting that kind of by default and in the absence of any other alternatives, Davos has actually become a place where important conversations are actually having to be had, because all of the old kind of institutions that used to shape and guide global affairs have fallen into such disrepair. You think about NATO or the UN, and so just by merely existing and being somewhere that people want to go to, Davos has actually assumed a kind of outsized importance, not in the UEFA pulling the strings kind of a sense, but in a slightly different way. And so all the leaders are going there, and even all the leaders of the old stripe, they're going there with their notebooks. They're trying to figure out what the kind of new era brings. But it's clear that their kind of approach to international politics, which is very much you have a photo op, you deliver a speech, you go away, that's not going to cut it when it comes to trying to figure out what's really at stake in the kind of not global order that's taking shape, but the kind of increasing global disorder that's taking shape. That sense that you can just go there and and the attempt you can see by these world leaders to send nice text messages to Trump and cajole him in a friendly way to get what they wanted. That whole model of international politics is certainly not going to come back, and is only going to be with the arrival of fresh blood in the European kind of elite, and with the change of elections, you'll have people with different ideas. We've seen this in the case of the right-wing populist parties in Europe have been actually leading the conversation with regards to what European autonomy might look like. Jordan Bardella talking of reviving the ghost of de Gaulle and trying to figure out what France might do. You've got the AfD opening a conversation about whether Germany should have nuclear weapons. Whether or not any of these solutions are quite the right one yet is open to question, but it's clear that it's not the kind of old elite that are going to actually find responses to this new world disorder, but actually probably some of the populists have been kept to the sidelines.
And we should talk a bit about, going back to, Trump's pressure campaign on Greenland. One of the pinch points that he zeroed in on this week was the UK's surrender of the Chagos Islands. He seems to believe that we were actually getting money out of this deal, which is extraordinary. He asked, is the UK broke or something? Because even he, realizing what a terrible deal it is to give away a piece of territory to Mauritius, to an ally of China, an ally of Iran. I'm not sure that Trump particularly cares about self-determination, but we should say that this is over the heads of the Chagosian people themselves. He thought we must have been given some money for this in exchange. In fact, we are paying for the pleasure of giving the territory away, which is extraordinary.
No, and in his own way has kind of forced that back onto the agenda. And because this deal, as everyone knows, doesn't make any sense from whatever angle you look at it from. If you're concerned about sort of decolonization and the plight of the Chagosians, and you should listen to the Chagosians themselves, who do not want to be under the thumb of Mauritius, who Chagos Islands who have migrated over to Mauritius in the wake of when the territory became what it is in the 1960s, have been subject to discrimination. And also just historically, everyone knows that the fact that it was even kind of lumped together with Mauritius was a kind of quirk of colonialism. It was a kind of part of the same sort of administrative block. It wasn't something, even by the admittance of the Mauritian political class themselves, it was a place that they never went to, that they didn't really know very much about, and they never really considered to be theirs. It was only later on in the 1980s, with a change of the ruling party there, that suddenly this became an act of blackmail and theft on the part of the British, which was suddenly much more railed against. Again, if you're thinking about the question of security, again, moving from a situation in which you do have sovereign ownership over that military base on Diego Garcia to just sort of leasing it off of Mauritius for a period of time, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And the only really firm conclusion you can come down to is that both this Labour government and its Tory predecessors, who kind of started opening this question when they were still in power, was the point about international law. That there were these, as it turns out, non-binding rulings, which led them to believe that they had no choice, or that they had to kind of negotiate something now so that they didn't end up losing it on worse terms later. It doesn't even necessarily stack up according to the international law experts, who would say that this is no justification for it. So particularly with Keir Starmer and Lord Hermer in place at the moment, I think it's sort of reminded that in the same way that sort of NATO ended up kind of infantilizing large parts of Western Europe militarily, like they felt that they didn't have to pay for or take responsibility over their own defence, because in their minds not only was there the post-Cold War peace dividend, but America would ultimately ride to the rescue. Not only has that been called into question, but also the way in which the political class in general, but this Labour Party in particular, their deference to international law is a way of avoiding trying to even think about broader geostrategic questions and interests. You just defer to the ruling of the international court, and therefore no more needs to be said about it. And yet it shouldn't take someone as a sort of singular and sui generis as Trump to come along and say, but why are you doing this? I think anyone who's looked at that question for longer than 5 seconds is tempted to ask that question of them as well.
Jacob, I mean, it is. It just feels as if the international law has become a kind of excuse to kind of hide behind. And what's really struck me is the amount of political capital that Starmer seems to be prepared to burn on this, not only looking stupid in front of the British public, who can't make neither head nor tail of it, but they really did a lot of work to sell this deal to the Americans, and initially the Americans did seem to go along with it. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, commended it as a fantastic achievement. Trump, via Rubio, supposedly said it was a great deal before having this realization during this kind of pressure campaign against the UK over Greenland. Why are they so invested in what is something that is obviously so nonsensical?
Yeah, well, firstly, I think the explanation for that lies in the fact that it's so of a piece of everything that is known about the very small and shaky thing that is Keir Starmer's character, which is that he is by kind of instinct in every regard the international lawyer, and defers to this kind of way of operating international politics. And so for him, it's just like logical that there's been a judgment in the international law. We're going to have to really get on board with this. And it does allow them to play. It allows the kind of British elite to maybe rehabilitate themselves slightly, playing the role of like divesting of colonial possessions on the world stage, which in the kind of mirror image of the old colonial a role that British elites used to play. But what's really interesting about this for me is, I mean, in one way, it also illustrates the difficulty that the West has with America, because you've got America kind of with this schizophrenic attitude to so many international questions. One minute they're supportive of the deal, they've been lobbied by the Starmer government, but in any case, I mean, it follows a long-standing historical American policy of encouraging former colonial powers to divest of their colonial possessions. Has been a track record policy of the United States for a long, long time. And then suddenly, almost because it seemed to be the only good argument in favor of securing Greenland, somebody happened upon this, probably saw it on social media, and it honestly was it seemed like a pretty actually good comparison to make with regard to Greenland, that one day maybe the Danish will just decide to get rid of it in the same way the British did Chagos. And so it became an issue, almost to fill the void that was that was there from any absence of any decent articulation in the public sphere, at least, of why Greenland was so important. And this schizophrenic attitude of the American kind of leadership on the world stage is partly what's driving a lot of this sense of instability, and it's what contributes to this sense of kind of growing danger and risk, especially among European leaders who are just casting around thinking, well, if America is so unmoored in terms of its strategic objectives, despite what it publishes and puts out, then anyone could be next for almost anything at any time.
Tom, do you want to add anything on this?
I think what has become clear, particularly as it relates to Europe, is the two things which seem to be certainly contributing to the instability or the uncertain responses from various European political leaders is like a combination of weakness and lack of seriousness, which has developed over the course of many decades now. So the weakness is relatively straightforward to assess, both in terms of allowing military capacity to wither on the vine, but also the economies which would otherwise sustain a country, as well as allow you the industrial base to produce your own defences.
Yeah.
Those two things crashed together has created a situation where even middle powers, which under any system are going to be having to kind of negotiate their way between larger powers and what their intentions are and what their leaders deem to be their national interests. You do that from a position of relative strength if you are much more capable of defending oneself, if you're presiding over a strong economy, if you're presiding over a country in which you have proper a stable civil society and democratic backing for your government, which is not obvious for many various Western European countries at the moment, where things are very, very teetering on the edge in respect of many of those things. And then there's just the question of the unseriousness. It's like they've never really had to confront any of these questions before, either because it was something that they up until the war in Ukraine, everyone acted as if conflict was a thing of the past, that it was just never going to happen again.
Or at least over there somewhere.
It would be over there. It would be a war of choice. War became basically a kind of foreign policy decision rather than something that would land on your doorstep. And they assumed that this would be the case forever. The sort of presentism of so many of our political leaders was really exposed over the course of the past 5 years. And again, the deference to and unhealthy level of belief in international law, globalist institutions to just keep things stable has been entirely called into question. So it's one of the things that they're now kind of thrashing around, having no idea what to do, is because they've partly by dint of the luxury of the past few decades, I suppose, but also because of the fact that they've vested so much of the decision-making, so much of the authority in unelected, distant institutions and mechanisms, that they've never really had to probably get to grips with this. Now they've been kind of forced to, in the light of a quite cartoonish challenge from Trump in relation to Greenland and so on. But it just shows that so much of the instability is not necessarily just coming from without, it's also coming from within these societies, which don't have a clear sense of what their policy is, how they're going to pursue it, and what conditions they would need to create in their own societies, both economically, militarily, what have you, in order to navigate what is always going to be quite a dangerous world. So all of that has just been thrown up in the air by the past few years, certainly.
Yeah, definitely. Continuing on our sort of security theme, I mean, there's what feels just like such an obvious mistake looming on the horizon. Keir Starmer, the Labour government, have approved the construction of a brand new Chinese mega embassy. It will be the largest in Europe. Of course, the problem is not that China having an embassy, it already does, but its location, the design of the building, there are just so many red flags about it. I mean, it's located right next to the Wapping telephone exchange, which is where extremely sensitive information is travelling through cables from the City of London to Canary Wharf, as well as, ordinary people's emails and things like that. It has scores of basement rooms with redacted plans, and it does sound almost, like something out of a some sort of spy novel. And yet it has been given the green light by the government. Seemingly they believe that they can mitigate or ignore or downplay the risks of this. Tom, what have you made of it?
Again, it's one of those decisions that if you explain it to someone for 30 seconds, they'll be wondering why the hell was this ever mooted, let alone agreed to in the first place. You don't have to be someone who thinks who's sort of spoiling for some sort of conflict with China to recognise that this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. The obvious security issues are there and plain for all to see, particularly the question of the secret rooms and so on, the fact that there is already pretty substantial reports of the way in which the CCP are kind of operating kind of secret police stations across various Western European countries, snatching Hong Kong activists and so on and so forth. All of this stuff is out there. And it seems like the political class just seems to swing violently between either over-the-top hostility or complete acquiescence where it relates to China, and that is not necessarily particularly useful. But I suppose going back to the theme that we've already been talking about, it's also from the perspective of a Labour government that doesn't really know what to do. So they invested a lot of effort in a sort of new charm offensive with China. The idea that increasing economic ties, the potential for more Chinese investment would be, if not the silver bullet, then something which would help spur growth in a otherwise anemic atmosphere for economic growth. So again, failing to kind of sort out economic questions domestically, they then find themselves over a barrel in relation to an issue like this. So again, it's something, there's a fair amount of blame to be shared on both sides. These plans didn't emerge entirely out of nowhere. I mean, even the fact that the Royal Mint is being handed over to a foreign government, the old Royal Mint is being handed over to a foreign government, seems to me bizarre, like in so many different respects. But once again, a product of a tremendous lack of foresight and just confusion on the part of this government.
Yeah, and it's worth saying it's not as if there haven't been, warnings from others. The local council opposes it, which usually is enough to end a project there and then. Even Sadiq Khan, not known for his common sense, has warned against it. All of our allies have warned against it. And yet, for some reason, this seems to be the only building project in the United Kingdom right now that's been given the green light. Or maybe the NIMBYs will stop it. They might prove to be the only force powerful enough to halt the CCP in its tracks. But Jacob, what have you made of the whole saga?
Well, the press reports were made for hilarious reading because they mentioned that they'd convened this kind of this soup of alphabet agencies to find ways of so-called mitigating the risk. And you imagine that actually what was going on was they were trying to find the only people from GCHQ or MI6 or MI5 that were prepared to say yes to it, and that they've been searching high and low for anyone who might actually. And the idea you can mitigate these risks of like secret basements and all the rest of it is obviously absurd on the face of it. But a play here is something that's a deeper trend, which is very much kind of in line with the things we've been discussing so far, which is that in the kind of era of increasing American relative decline and the absolute decline of European powers, China is looming as an increasingly attractive or even just sometimes useful kind of a foreign power that maybe occasionally European powers will try and balance off against America. Is not just happening in Britain. There's huge swathes of Chinese investment. You'll notice that Macron, although not the world's most savvy operator, but every time Donald Trump starts getting a bit more bellicose, he'll announce another trade deal or sweep of investment with China or plans to involve them more kind of vigorously. And you see that this is part of what lends, again, international politics, this dynamic of instability, because whereas in kind of the old era of the balance of powers, where power was kind of territorially bounded to certain areas of the world and each power was kind of kept to its sphere of influence, today instead you have this kind of the way in which the international powers are all projecting themselves all over the world. So Europe is becoming kind of faster a kind of battleground for China, for Russia, for India, for America, and there's not. That's what makes it precisely more unstable, is that there's no clear kind of settlement, and especially in Europe, which is very weak compared to these other powers, is inevitably going to become, as I say, this kind of a battleground. And the Chinese are obviously at the moment playing a very sensible game, especially when you try and compare them to, say, the policies of, or the strangeness of Donald Trump, which is just waiting, investing, and capturing. And that was actually one of the kind of frustrating things about the whole Greenland affair, was that if you think that there are some shared ideals that bind the Western world together, or at least could bind the Western world together, you had this insane patch of infighting that was just a massive distraction. And you imagined, as the arguments were going on over Greenland, China was quietly buying up another series of important national industries across the globe. And the West seems so divided internally that it's not ready or not really capable of dealing with this newfound threat from China.
Tom, do you want to add anything? Or
I think that's one thing about the current setup that needs to be stressed as well is like how intertwined as well all these things are. It's not necessarily that you have a kind of fortress America and a fortress China, and that Europe is being tugged somewhere, in one direction and the other, depending on the issue, depending on the sector, depending on the problem that they're trying to confront. Is that obviously even with the post first Trump term tariffs and trade war with China and all the rest of it kind of continued on by the Biden administration, they still got a hell of a lot to do with each other. There's still, as we were talking about earlier, a hell of a lot of Chinese presence in their hemisphere, which they seem to be so keen to rebuff. So all of these things are, again, so much more complex than is sometimes presented. And it does just come back to where Europe is concerned, the fact that so many of these issues are exaggerated or brought to a head because of that tremendous weakness which has been allowed to build up, and that until that is dealt with, then Europe is going to constantly be knocking itself from kind of one international crisis to another. It's fascinating that in recent years the question of European strategic autonomy has become something which everyone from Emmanuel Macron to Viktor Orban agree on, and yet particularly if you're talking about the Western European powers, they are still seemingly unwilling to break with their various orthodoxies, whether that's in relation to greenism or what have you, that would actually create the conditions that would allow for a Europe that was both economically stronger but also potentially much more militarily stronger. So it's the pennies dropped to a certain extent, particularly amongst the Western European technocratic class, that they're in a new era that they need to find a new path through. But at the same time, one Mark Carney speech notwithstanding, it's not obvious that much more serious thinking is really going on there.
Absolutely. Well, that's not the end of our conversation, because we're about to move over to Spiked Podcast Unlocked, where you can join us if you're a Spiked supporter. Of course, as Tom reminded you at the beginning of the show, we currently have a special January offer. So if you're not a Spiked supporter, then why not sign up now, and you can become one for just £1 a month for the next 3 months, and then £5 a month after that. So sign up now, take advantage of the offer, and join us over on Spike Podcast Unlocked to get the rest of this podcast. Thank you so much for watching the Spiked Podcast. We'll be back at the same time next week. In the meantime, why not subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel and then click the bell so you're always alerted whenever there's some new content. Spiked is producing more videos than ever, from podcasts like this one to interviews to our series of polemics. You really, really don't want to miss out on it. Plus, to get your daily dose of Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com. That's our website at spiked-online.com.